lens of a lot of things that we've been talking about. Through a lot of the lens of what we've been talking about. So let's return to a few things in terms of the discussion about Shakespeare and also about, we'll finish up with Christopher Marlowe. Now, a little fun thing.
After you pick up your plate, it's been sitting out there for days.
Not this. So that could have been, Gertrude and young Hamlet, who knows? Okay, so for those of you who've seen the film, there's this little scene where Shakespeare's he has to write a play, right? He's been commissioned to write a play. He's stuck. Ethel and the pirate, the pirates, yes. Ethel the pirates. Burbage says you have a play. So Burbage, all right, I'm going to translate this. You can hardly hear it. I don't know what the thing with the volume is. But so he says, Burbage says you have a play. So this is the thing. Burbage started the theater. His father built the theater, which was in Shoreditch. When we look at the map of London, Shoreditch is like to the east, northeast of the city limits. Because at this point, theater was allowed, it was, if you were sponsored by a nobleman, you could have a theater, you could build a theater house, and you could be there, but you couldn't really be in the city limits of London. So things were either on the south bank of the Thames, or they were in Shoreditch, which was to the northwest of London. So Richard Burbage's father, James, builds the first theater, which is literally called the theater. So he is going to then, the Lord Chamberlain's men, which is Richard Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, which was originally his company. If you know Richard Dudley, if you've seen the film Elizabeth with Kate Blanchett, you've seen that film? And Joseph Fiennes is also in that. He plays Dudley. That's her great love, supposedly, along with the Earl of Essex, who's Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. And so he had a company, and that may probably, Stratford-on-Avon is in his kind of duchy, his palace. So it's likely that young Shakespeare saw performances by his company. So it becomes the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which is Burbage's company. And then there's also the rival company at the Rose, which is Hensley, Philip Hensley. He's a theater manager. He's not an actor. He really is a theater manager. He's a producer. So when Marlowe asks Shakespeare here, you're writing something for Burbage, basically this has nothing to do with us. Sorry. So, yeah. It's interesting, but it's nothing to do with us. Don't be distracted. Okay. So what Marlowe said is that he's writing something for Burbage. At that point, you just got paid to write the play. There's no royalties. There's not going to be any author royalties until Dion Boucicault, the writer of melodrama, is going to sort of create author royalties in the 19th century. So here, if you're a writer, you just sell your play to a company of actors. Now, the company of actors are shareholders. So if you are a playwright, you want to be a shareholder in that company. So Shakespeare is a shareholder in the Lord Chamberlain. He becomes a shareholder. And that's one of the things that is discussed in the film, actually. But right now, he's writing for the Rose, for Hensley, and he's writing for Burbage. And as his star is rising, both companies are kind of competing for it. Both companies have their kind of lead actor. Hensley's company is the Rose, and their lead actor is Ned Aline, who Ben Affleck plays. Marlowe is writing for the rival, right? So it's really interesting in terms of, so Shakespeare is kind of at a loss. I love your early work. It's a joke, right? So that's the famous line. If anybody knows any line from Dr. Faustus, it's a line about how was this, the face that launched 1,000 ships and topped the towers of Ilium, Troy. So this is going to be, it becomes a big joke in the Stoppard screenplay that when people come to audition, they always quote Marlowe, right? But when Gwyneth Paltrow's what?
They do the 1 monologue.
They do the one monologue. So he hears, is this, yeah, right? It's the one, and they all say the great writer Marlowe, right? And Shakespeare's there going, oh my God, until finally, you know, the Gwyneth Paltrow character comes, and she speaks lines from his play, which is Two Gentlemen of Verona, which also, if you know the film of Shakespeare in Love, there's a scene where they're playing Two Gentlemen of Verona in the palace, and the queen's kind of bored, but she loves the clown in a bit with a dog. So if you know the play, there's Launce and his character of the dog. And that's probably her favorite clown actor, whose name is Ned Tarleton. And we're going to talk about Shakespeare's clowns and the comedies a little bit later. But so this scene is really great because it kind of imagines a meeting for them in terms of like Marlowe is the great kind of leading writer at the time. He's the top university wit. Robert Greene's around, Thomas O'Reilly's around, there's other people who are around. But Marlowe, what?
Ben Jonson?
Ben Jonson's going to come in a little bit later. Ben Jonson is around, but he's going to really start writing more in the Jacobean times. He's going to actually outshine Shakespeare, because he's going to write more to the taste of King James. So he's around, but he hasn't quite ascended yet. Beaumont and Fletcher are coming around. There's other writers that are around. But right now it's the early sort of part of what's happening in Elizabethan, the heyday of Elizabethan theater. So,
Massacre of Paris.
The Massacre of Paris. This is what he's writing. This is a play he's not going to finish, right? This is an unfinished play. This Shakespeare in Love takes place in the year of Marlowe's death. Marlowe's going to be killed very shortly. He's going to be killed during, if you remember, they get the news of Marlowe's death. So he's working on Massacre of Paris, a play he's not going to finish. Romeo and Ethel, the pirate's daughter, right? This is his big idea that he hasn't written a word of it yet, right? So, there's a pirate.
Can you turn up on the actual speakers?
No, I can't find it on the
It's
actual
on
speaker.
the top.
Oh, is it on the top?
Yeah. It's this right.
What's that?
Romeo is Italian, but Romeo is in Portugal.
Can you hear it?
Screw it up.
A little better?
His best friend is killed in a duel by
Okay,
Ethel's
so-
brother.
So what is this as the pirate, right? The pirate's daughter. So what do we know about like Roman New Comedy or whatever? It's a whole, like a lot of the Elizabethan comedies, like we saw Comedy of Errors, is going to be based on Greek New Comedy, Roman comedy. And a lot of those are like the pirates, right? Pirates is a big theme. So so Stoppard is putting in, this is dramaturgical candy. For anyone who knows anything about it, Stoppard's really smart. He puts in all kinds of little references throughout the whole film. You know, it gets into the whole love story, which interests me personally less, but interests a lot of other people. But I love the references that Stoppard puts in. And this is one of them. The whole thing is that there is a kind of, you know, taste in comedies at the time. And he's writing a comedy, right? He's off writing a comedy. But then Marlowe kind of gives him the plot.
His name is Mercutio. Mercutio. Good name.
Well, they're waiting for you.
Right? So basically, he says,
With your gift.
you know, he's
Your
love.
praise with Burbage. This is a different one. A different one you haven't written. What's this face?
He gives them the whole part about Mercutio.
He gave him the whole part about Mercutio, and he gave him the whole part, you know, about the rival families and whatever. So basically, he gives him the structure of Romeo and Juliet. And that's kind of an in-joke, the fact that Shakespeare couldn't write a plot to save his life, right? And that's sort of the in-joke of the thing.
Well,
He
he
has to
himself-
take... What?
I think he himself said like there are only 4 different stories. In the
Right,
novel.
right. So you might as well rewrite them. However, he was probably one of the greatest adapters certainly in English language history and, you know, in the history of the theater still. So, that's Marlowe. What's interesting in terms of, like, before we go away from Marlowe completely, again, the big thing that Marlowe did is that Marlowe put forward blank verse, iambic pentameter, right? Iambic pentameter, blank verse. Now, other writers had written in it, but he really made it the rage. And so it's not, Shakespeare also picked up on it. Shakespeare didn't invent it. Shakespeare picked up on what Marlowe had kind of got against something that was called the Galloping 14, which was the meter, which was kind of taken from French verse and translations, which was iambic but was 7 syllables. So it was a big mouthful, right, to do. And Marlowe kind of made it much more in the breath, 5 syllables rather than 7, which made a big difference in terms of how one could perform it, because one didn't have to run out of breath by the time one got to the 14th syllable.
So
right.
Marlowe made blank verse all the rage, or Shakespeare?
Marlowe. Marlowe made it the rage. Marlowe, iambic, pentameter, blank verse. He's the one who really put it forward, and it became a popular thing. So there became, and there's this whole thing that's happening, that's still happening in the world. Voluntary is part of it. Okay, I don't want you. I don't want you. Go away. Why do you always come on? I hate you. Reminder, one day. Thank you. Go away. Okay. So, there's a whole big thing about, was Marlowe Shakespeare? This is a
When
big
this
theory.
man died, he left a sad little poem for his gravestone. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he who moves my bones.
I'm interested in these people. It seems to me that the people who think that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare are either American snobs who tend to go for the Earl of Oxford, or great British eccentrics.
If you're too, it used to be if you were too rich, if you're too aristocratic. The Kennedys had a whole kind of thing in terms of that too. It had to be this kind of balance, you know, of like coming from, you know, bringing yourself up. Like when John Kerry, we'll talk about this when we talk about the Jonathan character. When John Kerry was running in the primary in the election, you know, whole thing, John Kerry came from an aristocratic family, you know, came from a lot of money. And so when he was in the primary in New Hampshire, he puts on a plaid shirt. In my class at Columbia, we had been talking about the Jonathan character, which is kind of a sort of emblematic, you know, Americana character, which is really, really deep in our zeitgeist. It's like Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, where Mr. Smith goes to Washington. Not an intellectual, not a sophistry, you know, not like, it's sort of like, almost like Aristophanes, you know, like targeting Socrates because he's a sophist and he uses words. The mistrust of European, British, educated, you know, kind of upper class thing is deep into like, I'm an American, you know, I'm not, you know, you East Coast intellectual feet intellectuals, if you remember that phrase, was being thrown around in the culture, what they called the culture wars of the last 20 years. Yeah.
I think it goes back to Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, where you want to seem approachable.
That's right.
And you don't want to seem
That's right.
too
Right.
uppity. And I know, like, too, with politicians, especially with Bill Clinton during his,
Right.
like, election, part of the reason he was elected was because he would walk around with bags of McDonald's.
Right.
And
George W. Bush, who, you know, Karl Rove was his advisor. There's a book, Bush's Brain. Karl Rove, who has said, keeps a copy of The Prince at his bedside, but that's his, like, Bible, you know. That, you know, he said, you know, you can't come from this millionaire Connecticut family. You got to be down home in Texas in the ranch, right?
Bush definitely seems approachable.
So it's like a really thing. And actually, Obama is not as approachable. Obama's a little bit too aristocratic. It's so ironic. It's really ironic. You know? Huh? Oh, he's so, he cannot, oh my God, he's so, I feel so sorry for him. Every time I look at him, it's like, please go.
Well, Bush made up words too.
They just haven't entered the language. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Okay, so
He's the one that
let's look a little bit at the ramp to this, right? So we have the morality plays, right? We have the chambers of rhetoric. So what's happening is that in the zeitgeist, you get these various things that kind of go into the cultural mix, into the cultural soil. And so you have, morality plays. So it's like the idea, are some of these plays still having components of morality plays? Where does that continuance happen in these plays? It's something to think about. What?
Are you gonna tell us who surpassed Shakespeare?
I
Oh, we're gonna talk about that later.
We're going to take about that later, because I have to pull up a link, because I'm going to do it on the link. So I don't want to spend time pulling up the link right now, because we're a little short for time, but I will pull up the link. And we will talk about that, because it's pretty fun. You might have a guess as to where it comes from, but we can talk about that. So what's happening here? We've talked about. Morality plays, chambers of rhetoric. The whole thing about chambers of rhetoric is that the use of language becomes popular. How people speak, the philosophy, how they, convince other people, how language is used to change people's hearts and minds. Rhetoric becomes popular, not just popular in the upper classes. It's like you get into a cab sometimes and you have a really, really intense philosophical or political discussion with the cab driver, because probably in their country there were doctors and teachers and whatever, so you can have amazing conversations. It was that. Like it was Joe Papp's dream for Free Shakespeare in the Park was about the fact that cab drivers and plumbers and doormen and everybody would come to Shakespeare because that's who came to the Elizabethan theater, and they would understand it, and they'd be able to talk about it because they weren't stupid, just because you were working in a different class did not mean that you were not intelligent and couldn't understand these things and have dialogues about these things. And he felt the more it was cultural democracy. And in Elizabethan times, there was a bit of cultural democracy in the theaters because everybody went. It was a little bit like a return to Greek times where you had the aristocrats and the intelligentsia, and they generally were up. And the groundlings standing, what became later would become the expensive seats. The cheap seats were on the floor, and there were a lot of benches of people standing and carrying on, and buying things to drink and yelling at the stage, and sometimes throwing things. It was the whole kind of thing. And Shakespeare wrote simultaneously to both audiences. He wrote to the intelligentsia, and he wrote to the groundlings with the humor, and he had little, coded things for both in language and in images for both audiences, which is again why they kind of become so interesting, is because he's not just writing to a narrow group of people. He's writing to a wide swath of people. And a lot of the Elizabethan writers were, at least the writers that were writing for the outdoor theaters. There were also indoor private theaters, and those tended to be much more starting to move to spectacle. Those started to move much more to entertainment. But in the outdoor theaters, there were big things also being discussed, like in the Greeks, like in the history plays, as England's kind of feeling itself as now a European power, right? Who is England? What is the history? What's the lineage of the Tudors? How do you shore up and flatter Queen Elizabeth, because it was meant to flatter Queen Elizabeth, but how do you sort of say the English people have this amazing history? So these history books are being published. And Shakespeare and other writers, as soon as a book gets published, they'll go, oh my God, Holinshed has just now published a whole book about Richard III. I'm going to write a play about Richard III. Holinshed's book was propaganda. But when you look at Holinshed's book and Shakespeare's play, it's eerie as how, the details of it mirror each other. So all this stuff is kind of making the soil, again, when the scholars come to Italy, and as the Renaissance starts to filter, including to England, the classical texts that are reprinted, Gutenberg inventing the printing press, suddenly these houses, in England can have not hand, copied, illustrated manuscripts from a monastery, but a printed book. They're still expensive, but they're available on a much wider scale. And then all of a sudden we move away from religious work. So here we have interlude. Again, an interlude is something that's performed by traveling players in a manor house at an aristocrat's dinner party, basically. It's what the traveling players do in England. They are performing an interlude. So the Protestant Reformation is going to have a huge impact on England because it's going to lay the way for Henry VIII to break from the Catholic Church, to break from Rome, and to say we're going to have the Church of England. And again, that sort of sets off England a little bit from the rest of Europe. So the full Renaissance is not really going to arrive as much as it does in the rest of Europe. So the kind of medieval elements are going to stay a little bit longer in England to some extent, which is how you look at like the collision of those elements and classical Renaissance elements that we find in Dr. Faustus. So in 1601, London has like 200,000 people about, and a lot of them are literate. They're well educated. The public schools are quite good. There's a real interest in order, the order of the universe, astrology, numerology. There's this thing called humors that starts to emerge. And humors are really interesting when you look at Shakespeare, and if you look at the character of Hamlet, the one thing that really happens in Shakespeare, and especially in Hamlet, is that you start seeing much more complicated characters. Characters that can go in all kinds of different directions, which is why they're really interesting to act. They're less one-dimensional than a lot of the other Elizabethan characters are. I mean, Faustus is interesting, but you kind of feel, well, he's a little one-dimensional, you know, whereas like Shakespeare's characters start to be really complex, especially Hamlet. But at this time, okay, I want to zoom on this. Can I zoom on this?
Control and the plus sign on the keyboard.
Okay, so humors. Has anyone encountered humors
Yeah. It's
before?
like, yeah, it's like one of the very first theories of psychology.
Yes, exactly. And it's like interesting because now in the health industry, they have like some people are cold and wet and dry. It's like what you eat and what your body temperature is. It's really interesting because certain health practices, like they say, you know, if you have like dry and hot or dry and cold and wet, and you know, or cold and dry, it's very much like the humors.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. A lot of this they were already playing around with this idea in Greece. So this was something that was kind of taken and then and worked upon. But it was like the whole idea of like you're different. It was different fluids. So blood was sanguine. Blood was like if you're sanguine, you're kind of like you have a good sense of humor. You're mellow. Probably eat a lot. Maybe you're a little like you put on maybe a few pounds, but you're kind of jolly. You tend to be mild and pleasant. You don't tend to get angry. You're sanguine. You have like, you might not be the greatest intellectual, but you're kind of smart and really, wise way. So sanguine was kind of, it's like, yeah, I'm going to roll with the punches. I'm sanguine. We still use it that way. Sort of a sanguine personality. Kind of like, you're kind of mellow. You're kind of mellow. And so it's like there's childhood, there's maybe a childhood innocence, spring, sanguine. Like phlegm is like, usually for older, winter, it's like wet and cold, you're phlegmatic, you're kind of grouchy, like a lot of the Senex characters are going to be phlegmatic, Shylock is going to be phlegmatic. It's going to be the type of like accountants, Scrooge, who's a Shylock kind of character, is going to be phlegmatic, those kind of old miser characters. Anyone who's sort of like grouchy and a lot of the characters, when you do them, they'll have like, you'll see characterizations where they have some sort of, they're always spitting up or coughing or like, or they have some sort of crunchy thing, like in their chest or whatever. So phlegmatic becomes one. Another one is choleric, which is easy to add. It's like fire. It's like the yellow bile. So phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So cholera, the cholera of the bile. The yellow bile, it's sort of like the sort of fire, and you're quick to anger, and you're jealous, but you're also passionate. and whatever. So if you look at the differences in performance, Hamlet at one point kind of says, one of the characterizations, interesting characterizations of choices is what choice do you make for Hamlet in terms of how do you play him? And the different kind of, where's color? Oh, yes, there it is. So if you look at the definition of the humor choleric, you'll say easily angered, proud, ambitious, and vengeful. Hamlet says that's what he is at one point, right? He says, that's what I am. So there's the choleric version of Hamlet's character.
Well,
Yeah?
It's kind of funny because, you know, like back then the liver was like a sexual organ.
That's right.
And so like bile
How do you
comes
know
from.
this?
I've studied.
Okay, yeah. So it's like that kind of like, all right, it's like an energy, it's sexual, it's whatever. So if you look at Mel Gibson's performance of Hamlet, which is really interesting, and Mel Gibson's performance of Hamlet actually walks straight into the big question of the play, is Hamlet actually mad? Does he feign madness, or does he go mad? Mel Gibson's Hamlet, because Mel Gibson is a little crazy himself, which is why when he plays characters, they're a little crazy. It's actually kind of compelling, because his own personal insanity kind of comes through. So his Hamlet's actually really interesting as this kind of choleric, angry, vengeful, passionate, kind of character. He's already mad, right? He's already a little crazy. You tend to be serious and maybe studious and sad. You know, Hamlet really wants to be
black
studious,
bile.
you know? He's come from, where has he come from studying?
City.
Huh?
Oh, wait, I know.
France?
German, a university in Germany, right? It begins with a W. What? Wittenberg. What happened in Wittenberg in 1514? Somebody nailed something on a church door. Martin Luther.
Oh, not even put that together.
Also, who studies at Wittenberg? Dr. Faustus. That's where he's just graduated from. Wittenberg, right? The seat of seditious knowledge. Interesting. But Hamlet kind of wants to go back. And in a way, sort of like, how old is Hamlet? If you really do the math, he's not 30. Because if you look at, you know, when York died, and when he was a child and whatever, York is probably based on Richard Tarleton, which is Queen Elizabeth's favorite clown, who is most likely the clown who's playing Launce in Shakespeare in Love. Here, let's see if I can find it. A little thing. I'll show it when we get to the clowns. So the whole idea of, you know, melancholia was a very popular way to play Hamlet for a very, very long time. That Hamlet is kind of broody and sad and studious, and he sort of feels like one step away from, you know, you believe that he would commit suicide. So, but the whole thing is like, is he mad? Does he feign madness? Does he go mad? Is a really big question for anyone who's playing the role. And Shakespeare in the play gives all kinds of signals.
What about the fourth option, that
Yes.
that he's not mad,
Yes.
and that everyone around him is mad?
Oh, that's a very good one. So that he's like, he's the one that's sane.
Right.
Yeah.
Him and Horatio.
Him and Horatio are the ones that are like the Renaissance men in this kind of crazy world.
So they
Yes.
come back and everybody's
Yes.
just.
You can totally do that. You can push the absurdity of the rest of the characters to a certain extent. It's interesting if you look at Richard III in terms of who's moral. Nobody's moral around him either, you know. We'll talk about that. Why does Lady Anne give in to him? If she's so, it's the hardest scene to do. If you can figure out,
He's hot stuff.
if you can figure out how to do the Lady Anne scene in Richard III, you have a real kind of thing on the play. It's the problematic. There are problematic scenes in each of the Shakespeare plays that actually hold the DNA of the play itself. The most problematic, the end of Taming of the Shrew, right? If you can figure out how to do the end, then you do it. The fifth act of Merchant of Venice, right? And all the scenes or the parts that are problematic are the ones that if you solve those, then you have an entry really into how the play works. And a lot of times, you know, you see things like I don't know how many productions of Merchant of Venice I've seen where you get through the 4 acts and go, oh my God, it's a trial. And then the 5th act is like, what? Suddenly there's a comedy again, and they're like, you know, oh, my ring, you took my ring, and me. Really? Daniel Sullivan, when he did it in the park with Al Pacino. Did anybody see that production? This was a few years ago. I'll talk. Oh yeah, I'll talk about that when we get to. So.
Never gonna miss another Shakespeare.
So this is. Oh, I want to say this is Laurence Olivier, who was sort of the, you know, model for Shakespearean acting for a long time. What you see before the shot, I thought this clip had it. You see Ophelia sobbing. It's actually a really good scene with him and Ophelia. If you look at the dynamic between Hamlet and Ophelia, and the question is, does he really love her? Why, you know, why does he want? What's going on between her? In this version, it's a really interesting dynamic relationship between and his feeling of being betrayed by everyone, including her. But she's caught, right, between the duty to her father. She has no identity. She's dutiful to her father, and we'll talk about this next week when we talk about the presentations. And I want to go over the presentations too, like maybe after the break or right before the break to go over that. But the whole in the Olivier version is actually a really interesting scene. And what's interesting is that because people use different versions, there's 4 quartos, and then there's the folio version. In some of the quartos, the Ophelia scene is before the to be or not to be speech, which I always really like. You know, in some versions, the to be or not to be speech is before the Ophelia scene. But I love it after, because then he really is. He's just lost a woman he loves and had to, and she's crying or whatever. He's really feeling.
Take out that, because he says, fair now, sweet.
No, that's at the end of the other scene with Paul Polonius. When he's like reading, that goes into it.
So
it just, that line just goes to the end of another scene.
Do you think that Ophelia's pregnant?
I do, and I will tell you why. And it's all about herbology when she comes with the little things that she says, here's rue for you. Well, it's also we'll talk about right now. We can talk about it more next week. Rue for you. Rue was one of the herbs that was used to either bring on menstruation or to help with symptoms of menopause or as an abortive device. So either she's really young and just menstruating, or she's pregnant, which she's in real trouble. And when she says, I know, it's great, isn't it? When she says to Gertrude, here's rue for me and rue for you, you must wear your rue with a difference, gives you a hint into Gertrude's age. She's about to go into menopause, and into 1 or 2 decisions about Ophelia. Either she's like 13, 14, which does make sense in terms of, you know, the girls in, like Juliet, she's Juliet age, or she might be pregnant.
I like the
It's a choice.
idea of,
you know, it doesn't say the text, and this is the thing with Shakespeare, gives you hints to roads you can follow. You got to go, oh, I could follow this road. It makes sense. I can follow the road that Hamlet has a total, you know, Oedipal complex with his mother and is jealous of you know, and the reason he didn't have his father was that his father was away all the time, you know, fighting wars. So anyway, yes. So here is a little bit. This is actually at Elsinore. This is the actual castle in Denmark where Hamlet is set. Shakespeare never saw it, but knew of. Informed a lot of classical work. Have you heard you do this at all? Okay. You'll recognize it. Basically, I'll break it down very quickly. It's the idea that there are 3 that people are driven by 3 essential things. You're driven by your physicality, or you're driven by your emotions, or you're driven by your intellect. Which, you know.
It's like the same kind of, isn't that like a little bit of Chekhov too?
Yeah.
It's like
Michael Chekhov? Yeah. Michael Chekhov is kind of a modern version, more grounded version of Del Sarto. Del Sarto's all about style, and Michael Chekhov brings your emotions and things. I love physical. I love the Michael Chekhov physical, because I think, if you get your body in a particular way, your brain does. It's like, they say, if you keep smiling, you'll suddenly start feeling better. If you do like this, for 5 minutes, you'll start feeling really depressed, And it's all about the body and how the body and the emotions are attached. So Del Sarto was like not so much psychological, like you were going to feel it, because it wasn't about feeling. It was all performative, all what you showed the audience. It was the same kind of gestural life. The way in Asian theater, when we talk about Asian theater, we're going to talk about what you're doing, that's right. We're going to talk about like how the sleeve, the gestures of the sleeve is a language. The hands, also in Elizabethan, the hands, what you did with your hands. And in rhetoric, used to be in speeches, and if you learn speech making, you hear really bad people who give speeches badly, they'll go, yes, we have to do this, because that's the gestural life of public speaking. So it's kind of all gestures, what the colors of a mask are, what the fan does. Yes, yes. And you do this, yes, those are things. They are effective. They are effective. If you watch effective speakers, they either do it with their voice, which is the great Southern Baptist preacher tradition that Martin Luther King worked off of. So there's a gestural musical thing, or they'll do it with physical gestures, or both. But it all is about, it's sometimes Machiavellian, sometimes it's just natural expression. But the Del Sarto thing was like, basically, if you were like a guy, you were working class, and you were here, close to the torso, and you walked with your shoulders. This still happens. I mean, see how some of this still translates. And you kind of walk like this, right? You're very close to the body. If you're a woman, especially a young damsel in distress, you show the vulnerable insides of your body. Like you'll show this, so you'll do this. Or you'll sit with your thigh, kind of exposed. Or you'll expose your neck and your eyes, your eyes will be like that. So you see the melodrama poses,
The whole.
Yes. Right. It's like, and your hands, you're
Classic
exposed.
ingenue.
Huh?
The classic ingenue
The
thing.
classic ingenue. That's Del Sarto. It becomes melodrama, but it was also in classical acting. Like they did a really terrific I thought it was terrific production called Red Velvet, which looked at Ira Aldridge, who was the great black Shakespearean actor who ended up being quite a star in Europe. This was like, before the Civil War. And I loved what they did in the production because they actually performed with those types of gestures that they would have used. So he would like deliver the speech with great power and, real, not mannered, but he would get into this pose and go like this, I am heroic. So, and then the intellectuals, or the upper class, it was all about the extremities, your fingers and your toes, and your nose would be up. So when they say looking down your nose at someone, that would be because your nose would be up and you would look down your nose at someone because you're an aristocrat. And you do things like this. This is going to really influence the restoration type of acting too. If you do restoration, some of these gestural lives will come into it. Yeah, what?
So The Office, there's this episode where Jim convinces Dwight to speak basically.
The Office,
like
Roman comedy, new comedy.
Yeah,
Yes, go ahead.
but I have this 1 minute clip really quick.
Yeah.
Of it's just the speech that he gives, and
Yeah.
it's funny how convincing it actually turns out to be.
And is he gesturing? Yeah. There you go. That's right. That's right.
I'm writing about.
And everyone's like, yes, correct.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. No, totally.
They know what they're talking
People are using these tropes, right? The new meaning of trope, trope used to be the interpolation into the mass. Now trope
Bang
means
your
these
fists
kind
and
of,
wave and everyone will agree.
these things that become common shared images of, how you gesture, what you do with the voice of oration, the musicality of it, and how you do it in order to convince others. So it can either be Machiavellian, how you, flatter, what you say, the words you say to inspire people, how you give people hope, all those types of things tie into a lot of acting on the stage, but also in terms of, what people do in the masks that they put on and the roles that they play in real life. It factors in. So anyway, that's a quick thing of Del Sarto. So you can see with Olivier that he really was kind of still had one foot a little bit in 19th century acting. So I think there was a kind of like thinking, this is the way Shakespeare was done. And there's a big dispute in terms of how realistic, how mannered Shakespeare was done. Shakespeare's advice to the players in Hamlet, I think, really gives you a sense of how it was done, because he's saying, don't do it that way. Don't saw the air, right? He's saying, don't use all those mannered gestures. Speak the speech, I say, trippingly on the tongue. It's fast. He says the 2 hours passage of our time. 2 hours. Says this play only lasts 2 hours. Most productions, they last 3 hours because people say I'm speaking Shakespeare and it needs to be done like this because it's classical and I'm classical and you are now being raised in your vibrant. No, you're not.
Speak the speech.
Speak the speech. You're tripping on the tongue, right?
Huh?
Huh?
But if you mouth it,
yes.
many of our players do.
Yes, say it.
The term crier spoke my mind.
Lord, do not sob
Yeah.
Thus they use
all
Tempest and as a whirlwind of your passion was
Whirlwind of
acquired
your
me.
passion.
A tempest
Let's hear that line again. Let's hear that line about the whirlwind of your passion.
But in the very torrent, tempest, and as I may say, the whirlwind of passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it smoothness. Oh, it offends me to the soul to hear a robustious, periwig plated fellow,
Right?
tear passion to tatters, to very rags, to split the ears of the groundlings, who for the most part are capable of nothing but inexplicably dumb shows and noise. I would have such a fellow whipped for overdoing termagant and out Herod's Herod, praise.
Right. What is he criticizing? Chewing the scenery acting, right?
Yes.
Like saying, I'm so passionate, but it's like, no, I'm passionate, but I'm temperate. It's like, let the audience feel your passion. Yeah, suit the action to the word, a best advice for acting ever.
I mean, that
Ever.
monologue is
Play the
like-
action on the word. Don't get the feeling and then say, I have the feeling. Now I'm going to say the line. Put the feeling on the word. It's the best advice to actors. Still, yeah.
I feel like that stigma also carries back to Greek theater and Roman theater.
Oh, absolutely.
Just the way that people tend to read
Absolutely.
classical texts and such.
Well, when we think about Greek
Even
theater,
like- even
what
like-
did we know? We know that it was in dactylies and iambs, right? Not in trochees. Not boom, 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 boom. It's like
Even
different, and it was sung different. Like we looked at gospel at Columbus, right? More towards that, different musicality and thing, but the feel of it. You were at church.
I mean, sometimes it even gets to the point where like people do it to like Miller and like Tennessee Williams and stuff like that. Where
And
it's like,
Eugene O'Neill.
Yeah.
When Kevin Spacey did, when his first role was in Long Day's Journey into Night with Jack Lemmon. He was way too young. I was showing a clip to another class, and I forgot how good he was. It was his first debut role. And he was too young to play Jamie. And he's like so good in it. But Jonathan Miller, who directed it, said, this is an Irish family. They talk over each other. They don't wait. It's not like I'm speaking Eugene O'Neill's words now. It's like, no, I'm in this family and I'm arguing and our passions are high and we're doing it. And it's like, and it was so fast. It was the fastest long day. It wasn't that long a day, right? Like Long Day's Journey into Night is like, oh my God, it's a long day's journey into night, right? Oh, O'Neill, but it was like, no. this was an Irish, family, and they were alive. They were alive people. They weren't like, great literature on the stage. They were real. They were O'Neill's, family. He was like boisterous, and it wasn't, I am Eugene O'Neill. So, that wasn't who he was. But again, there's a classist thing that comes in too. It's about, it's about kind of like what's high art, what's low art, and Shakespeare and the Greeks are high art. And it's like, no, they were actually high and low art, simultaneously. Some professors will have go into angina at that thought.
How could you say that the Greeks were high and low art if, like what you said, Aristotle believed that, the women and the slaves just sit in the back and the...
But they were there.
But they were there, okay.
But they were there.
There it is.
They might have been in the back, but they were there. The groundlings might have been standing, but they were there.
Okay.
Wasn't that there wasn't a division, but they were both there.
Okay.
And they were both being spoken to.
Okay.
Yeah. And they were both understanding it.
What do you think it is now?
What?
No, the theater. 'Cause I think.
What do you think?
Yeah. It's.
Well, it's commerce.
I don't.
So it's whatever the traffic will allow.
Yeah.
It's commerce.
I taught theater at a local summer camp in Puerto Rico, and there were 9 to 13-year-olds, and none of them had ever gone to the theater.
Right. Well, who can?
Or taken a theater.
Well, but is it about who, like...
Yeah, what is it about?
Is it about how much it costs, or is it about what the substance is?
And what do they go to see, and who's it talking?
Yeah.
Is it
Yeah.
talking
Because
to them?
even if they...
Is it talking to
No,
them?
it's definitely the substance.
And the commercialism of it. The way
Yeah.
that people
It's
go
money
see-
making.
Because if the substance is low but the price
Phantom
is high...
20 times, but they won't go see another
Because-
off-Broadway full person.
Well, I go to the theater all the
Right.
time, and I sit there thinking, God, if I didn't go to the theater, I would see this, and I would never go to the theater again. It happens to me all the time. And in some very fancy productions, too. I kind of go, why? Which is my whole thing, which is why I say my Aristotelian element is thought. Because if you talk about the journalistic questions, how they match up with the Aristotelian questions, where, when, the unities, and who, and how, and like all that. Why? To me, the biggest question always is why. Why are we here? Why are we talking about this? Why do you want to do what you want to do? Why do you not want to do what you want to do? And how? How is the story told around you, and then who and all that. But why? Why are narratives being told in the way they're told at the time they're told, which is what we're looking at. We're looking at why do these plays and how do these plays evolve and who do they speak to and all that.
There's another class that I took last semester called Spanish Theater from and
the Golden Age?
Yeah, well, we were discussing the way that theater works in it was Rio, was the example that we were using. And Argentina. And the way that theater is government subsidized. It's in people perform it in their homes to maybe 20 people. It's so many small productions compared to these Broadway 1,800 seat theater kind of situations. And the way
it's
that
really interesting because go ahead.
It's so much more accessible and it reaches people on a completely different level.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's the way that people can connect to theater in that sense is the way that we are most drawn to it, is that it has that meaning and the straightforward way of reaching people, connecting a small group compared to...
Which is why the little theater movement began, after, really after the Abbey Theater came through with John Millington Synge's production of Riders to the Sea and Playboy of the Western World. People went, oh wow, well we can't do this in big things that are 2,000, we need to have smaller houses. And so the little theater movement that had begun in Europe, which we'll get to this, it begun in Europe to do the works of Ibsen and Strindberg and Chekhov, this newfangled weird thing called realism and naturalism, which was like, whoa, shocking. Dollhouse, the door slam heard around the world. We'll get to that. But when they came through, the little theater movement, and that's the Provincetown Playhouse, was one of those theaters where Eugene O'Neill, was shaped. And we'll talk about that. But look, like today, some of the more interesting things you're going to find still in little theaters. It's why the off-Broadway movement started, and it's why the off-Broadway movement started, you know, in tiny little 99 or less seats, you know, where you go in, you're intimate, and you're right there with something, and it's like more outrageous and daring because you don't have to sell 2,000 seats or 1,000 seats or 500 seats. You only have to sell 99 seats or 60 seats a night. Right? And it's not about making money. Nobody's making money. Believe me, nobody's making money. But they are making art.
It's like the Grassroots show. That wouldn't have been the same production.
No.
We're in the.
Oh, you couldn't do it. You couldn't do it. And we're actually going to make it smaller. We're going to make the course smaller so that other people can join in the communities. And so Johnny, like John Summers is this Josh Fox thing, would be called up from the audience. Like you'd be saying, come up, can you play Johnny? Here's your lines. Yeah, it's what Josh and I developed it's called dramatic karaoke. We did it in a show called Surrender. Yeah.
That's absolutely beautiful.
And it's a way to have the audience come in. But this happened in 19th century touring Shakespeare companies, like in mining camps. You know, the miners would have the Bible, and sometimes they'd have Uncle Tom's Cabin, and sometimes they'd have, like, you know, Shakespeare, the complete works of Shakespeare. Those were the 3 books that were the most popular in the 19th century. But the Shakespeare companies would come through, and then you'd have the company do the lead roles, but the smaller roles, like, you know, the miner would come and say, and that's why you had prompters. It wasn't just that the actors were forgetting their roles because they were in rep. It was because, you know, like, I'm going to go on stage, you know, with the character that has 10 lines. And I'm part of the miner. I'm one of the miners. Because they're not going to, you know, they're not traveling with 30 people. They're traveling with probably more what Shakespeare's company was, 11 to 13, which you can break down. When I worked at the Public Theater, one of the first jobs I did for Joe Papp was to look at all. He said, I want to do a small, it never happened, I wish it did. I want to do a small core company of like 11 to 13 actors, and I think we can do all the plays that way. And so I went, this was my first dramaturgical assignment. It was fantastic. I was like 22 years old. I was like in seventh heaven. Because I went through all the plays and I read all these things to see how the plays could be done with 11 to 13 actors, and they can. And you look at the doubling, like in Lear, Cordelia doubled with
the Fool.
That's right. And when you think of it, he says, my poor fool is hanged. Is he talking about Cordelia? Is he talking about the fool? Same actor, same young actor. So the fool was young.
Well, that's what was done with the original companies, right? It was that small.
Yeah. And so you look at the doubling starts to become really, really interesting. And, you know, like the actors tended to play the same character. So, so let's look at just some of this is kind of a fun thing. In terms of like some of the choices that are made for characterization and how. All right, so we saw Mel.
I appreciate that there's German subtitles.
It's Hamlet, right? But it's also based on an actual Hamlet, the Ur-Hamlet, of an old Saxon tale of this prince whose father, you know, is killed by his brother, and Hamlet starts to take revenge. There's also an Ur-Hamlet that's called, it was another play that existed at the time. The Ur-Hamlet.
You couldn't come up with a name for it.
You are Hamlet means like the preceding Hamlet that people know of. So that there was another Hamlet and this is where the sources become interesting in terms of Shakespeare's sources, which I'm going to send you all this because it's going to be useful for your presentations. This is a kind of little cheat sheet of Shakespeare's probable sources, right? So Titus Andronicus may have been started by Marlowe or Thomas Kyd or done in conjunction with Shakespeare, and it was modeled on a Seneca play, Thyestes. Remember who Thyestes was? Thyestes, the father of Aegisthus. Thyestes, a part of the whole curse of who served his children, right? Served his children after he had an affair.
Oh, which happened
No.
in Titus Andronicus.
Huh?
That happened in Titus Andronicus.
Right. So it isn't the story of the play, it's the events of the
There
play
wasn't there just one where people were like
translated.
throwing up and stuff?
Yeah.
There was just a
people had
production
to
of
leave the theater.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
That's crazy.
this is kind of,
That's like,
I
feel like that's like Quentin Tarantino's Bible. Is
Oh,
Titus Andronicus.
Jacobean?
He should do
Quentin
Titus Andronicus.
Tarantino would have been a Jacobean writer.
Yeah.
He totally, no.
Wow.
That if you look at his films, they're completely Jacobean. The kind of cynicism about morality, the celebration of violence, but at the core of them, they're morality tales. Because Jacobean kind of goes back to medieval morality tales a little bit. We'll talk about that in the
that's like
second
what
half.
all of his
So Titus is like very about like Seneca. And this is the other thing. Like T.S. Eliot will say, no Elizabethan hero dies without the stench of Seneca. He didn't like Seneca because he thought Seneca was over the top and operatic and whatever. But what the Elizabethan writers, including Shakespeare, are going to take from Seneca is the 5-act structure. And this is in the Hamlet notes that I sent you too. Hamlet notes, okay. So in the Hamlet notes, so it's the 5-act structure that comes from the Roman plays, especially Seneca. The exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, catastrophe. In Act 1, what do we have? We have the rotten state of Denmark, right? We hear all about the backstory, what's happening, and it's a call to vengeance. And that's the other thing, that this play is in the whole thing. If you look at the English Renaissance timeline, you'll see there's the Revengers tragedy, the Spanish tragedy. There's a whole thing about the Revenger tragedy. The Revenger tragedy is absolutely the taste of the time. It's like everyone wants to go see a Quentin Tarantino film. That's very much the zeitgeist of the time. People love Revenger. And it's like, the hero is wronged and seeking revenge, right?
Well, in his, he rewrites history, too.
The what?
In Tarantino, he rewrites history, like with Inglourious Bastards, where he made it so that, they killed Hitler.
Right.
Cars
Which is also the
swaps
rewriting of
and
history of Shakespeare, yeah.
So it's like,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's what happens in Richard III. History is rewritten. So now, without hesitation, your protagonist is going to try to get a revenge on the antagonist, right? On the person who wronged him. So that would be Claudius, right? So at the beginning, the Elizabethan audience thinks, okay, we're going to see a revenge play. Because what does a revenge play have? Well, a revenge play has the wronged hero. You have that. That's Hamlet. He's supposed to seek revenge. It's an atmosphere of gloom and terror, elements of supernatural. There's an innocent woman that the hero loves who might also be at risk or that he has to save. There's a counterplot that's started by the antagonist against the hero, right? This is all part of the Revenger tragedy that the hero has to defend himself against. And a lot of the Revenger tragedy is the hero trying to get to the antagonist to kill him in revenge and being thwarted by various things, especially the antagonist's counterplot against the hero. And then the hero would achieve revenge, but then probably be punished by heaven, but would be fine. I'll take my punishment, but I have, gotten revenge. So that's the kind of classic Revenger tragedy. So if you look at Hamlet, that has a lot of the elements, right, of the Revenger tragedy. So you kind of go, okay, that's I lost my, oh, there it is. So if you look at, right, the first scene, it's doom and gloom, right? They're on the battlements. And again, the Elizabethan stage, it could be daytime, right? But what you're saying is that you have this dark, and the language sets it up. The language is going to set up the mood of the darkness. It's like you're on guard, and who's there? You're a little nervous, right? It's Fortinbras is on. We don't talk about Fortinbras in terms of revenge.
It's now struck 12. Get into bed, Francisco. This week, most days, this bit of coat. Nice.
So they're going to be
Have you had clients now? For the most
next year, and I'm just going to go and revenge. And what we watch in the play is that he doesn't do this, right? And it's all the reasons he does not do this. What are some of the reasons that he just doesn't go?
He wants to make sure.
He wants to make sure.
And he can't kill him while he's praying because then he'll go to
Can't
heaven.
kill him while he's praying. He also doesn't believe that the ghost is like, where's the ghost from? It's the ghost of temptation. It's from heaven or hell. It's a little medieval, right? He's caught himself, the way Dr. Faustus is, between medieval and Renaissance thinking. He's a little superstitious, but he's also an intellectual, right? He's been at school. He wants to go back to school. He would probably like to be in school for the rest of his life. He doesn't want to, idea of that, him being king in a way. He's glad probably his uncle is king, right? He doesn't want to, to be there. He's come with his friend Horatio. His other so-called friends come to visit, and so his whole idea is what and who can he trust? Who will betray him? Who is telling the truth? Is the ghost? Will the ghost betray him? Will the young woman he loves betray him? She does, right? She does, and we'll talk about her more next week when we talk about female characters and dutiful daughters. She has to. She has to because she has to do what her father says. She's not married to him, so she hasn't, shifted her allegiance from father to husband. It's also something, and even if she does, where's the duty to the father even after she moves to the husband, which is the whole point that comes up in King Lear. When Cordelia says, if I marry, how can they say, that they're loyal to you when they have husbands? If I'm married, I'm going to split my allegiance between my father and my husband. But the allegiance is to the dominant man. This is going to come up too in Duchess of Malfi and Jacobean. We'll talk more about this next week. The whole role of women and the narrative. Again, the narrative that they have to play and the roles they have to play inside this society. What the boundaries are for them. What Gertrude's position is. What Ophelia's position is. We'll talk more about this specifically next week when we look at the play from their lens. But, so Hamlet doesn't do revenge. And so he says, okay, the traveling players arrive, right? While he still thinks Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are there for him, right? And then they admit that they were sent for, and then he slowly finds out that they're just there to betray him. They're part of this plot, whether or not they're innocent about it. They don't realize how nefarious it is, They just think, okay, you're worried about Hamlet, I'll tell you, but he's starting to see different kinds of stakes. Tom Stopper's going to write a play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, about poor Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, how, Machiavellian were they? Were they paid? Were they really concerned about Hamlet? What was going on? The fact that is they betray him, whether they know the extent of their betrayal or not. Ophelia betrays him, right? There's that moment in the scene, and we'll try to look at a little piece of the Olivier production scene, where he says, where is your father? And she says, at home. And where is his father? Where's her father?
Behind the curtain.
Behind the curtain, right? The arras, the curtain. Everybody hides behind the curtains, right? There's all this hiding behind curtains. And listen, all this Machiavellian kind of plotting of how to get power and how to, work things out. I mean, Polonius is probably based on William Burghley, who was like Queen Elizabeth's chief counselor, who kind of was like this sort of, almost exactly like Polonius. There's a lot of scholarship that says that he just wrote Polonius, basically, as Burghley, who's kind of pompous, and, he'd be a dottore character when we get to Commedia, kind of like, sort of like Pappus, the Pappus character that we talked about, the kindly old man. He's kind of like, oh, I'm just going to like have this conversation with you. And Hamlet just runs rings around him, right? But he gives good advice to his son and to his daughter. You know, he's a kind of a good, kindly old man, he's called. He's the Pappus character from Roman comedy. There's elements of comedy too in Hamlet. That's an interesting thing. It's a tragedy, but there's also comic archetypes in it too, as well. And you know, if you have an antic Hamlet, the play really can push in that way. A lot of scenes are really fun until they're not, right? It's interesting to play it for the lightness, and then it kind of goes. The Gibson production kind of does that, though. He's so crazy that, you know something's going to happen. So the Revenger, the whole thing about the Revenger tragedy, Shakespeare has Hamlet thwart the expectation of the audience. He knows that they want a Revenger tragedy, and then he doesn't give it to them because he wants them to think about, you know, the whole idea of revenge, which is why Harold Bloom, who's a great scholar, though I think also an elitist, but is quoted by a lot of people, has the dictionary of literacy and things like what you should be to be at a certain, you know, level. He's the Aristotle of our time. You know, he says, you know, certain people like enjoy learning, you know. But he has some good, you know, he says some good things. And he says, he has a book called Shakespeare, the First Humanist, and the fact that, you know, Shakespeare really was broadening the discussion about what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a king. In the history plays, a lot of those plays are going to be what it means to lead a country. You know, is it like, yes, once more into the breach of Henry V, or is it like, you know, twice gorgeous majesty, you know, the weight of being a king, the you know, the responsibility of being a king. But in terms of Revenger tragedy, there are Revenger tragedy heroes in the play, right? Who are they? There's two of them, besides Hamlet, actually.
Laertes.
What?
And Laertes.
Laertes, absolutely. Laertes.
And
Fortinbras, right?
And Fortinbras. That's absolutely right. Laertes and Fortinbras. Fortinbras is often cut out of the play, right? In that first scene, it says, you know, he wants revenge. He wants his father's. Hamlet's father killed his father. Older Hamlet killed older Fortinbras, right? And now, and Clive's saying, oh, you know, we're going to say, keep his uncle, right? Keep him in line. It's a little parallel thing. And then Hamlet runs into Fortinbras as he's coming into Norway. He says, oh, we just want to get to Poland, right? We just want to get to Poland. You know, from Norway to Denmark to Poland. And at the end, he comes in, right? They're the ones on it. Now, what's really interesting, Ingmar Bergman did a really amazing production of this play at Bann a number of years ago with Peter Stormare as Hamlet. Peter Stormare plays a lot of villains. He's a big sort of Swedish actor. If you know Fargo, he's the big guy in the film Fargo who puts the other one in the wood chipper. He's really scary. Yeah, he's really scary. So he played Hamlet. So he's killed, right? And it's the end of the play, and Horatio, I always wondered why Horatio doesn't have the final lines. Why does Fortinbras have the final lines?
Is Fortinbras in charge?
Because Fortinbras is in charge. You're absolutely right. So what Bergman did, which Oscar Eustace kind of lifted for a production he did in the park a couple of years ago. So we're sitting there, you know, it's the end, everybody's dead, except Horatio, you know, good night, sweet pea, you know, Prince, flights of angels, sing you to thy rest. And then suddenly, the back wall of the set gets kicked down. There's all this loud, like, rock music. You kind of almost go forward in time. Everyone comes in black leather with boom boxes and guns, you know, and Fortinbras comes up, you know, like, rah. And, like, everyone comes in. And little Horatio goes up to him. He says, well, you know, what's going on? And little Horatio goes up to him to sort of tell him. Fortinbras waves his hand to one of the soldiers. They take Horatio to the side of the stage, and they shoot him dead. And Horatio is dead, too. And the whole audience goes, ah! Literally, we all go, ah! They've just shot Horatio. Horatio's fabulous. And you kind of go, of course he's dead. Of course he's dead. There's no stage direction. Of course he's dead. Otherwise, why wouldn't he be speaking? Why wouldn't he the Hamlet's best friend, the one that Hamlet said, was man, the Renaissance, the ultimate Renaissance. Why wouldn't he have the final lines? It's because he is dead. Because Laertes comes in like a true revenger character, right? And it's a great scene in the Tenet production too, where he comes in and says, "Where is it?" He pulls the sword or a gun in this production on Claudius right away and says, "It's your fault. My father's dead." He's ready to kill him right there. And I go, no, Laertes, don't kill him. Because he is a true revenger character. He doesn't think, he doesn't want, he's just going to act, right? There's no, distilling thought and, that sets, aside the hue. The action is not set aside. He acts. And he acts like a revenger hero. And he says, hue of resolution, right. So it's like, he has it. And he says, "Where is it? It's your fault." And he said, "Claudius must get out of it." Gertrude saying, "No, put it down. Don't do that." And then, he sees his sister, and then he's sort of like, "Oh my God, his sister's gone crazy with her rue for you, and, you must wear your rue with a difference, a little plea." Yes.
Rosemary's Remembrance.
Yeah. All these herbs that were, had meanings, but also were curatives, that you would take. It was herbology that you would take. So Laertes is the revenger hero, and at the end kind of gets his revenge. He kills Hamlet, but it's not a sweet revenge. He realizes he's been manipulated by Claudius, the ultimate Machiavellian.
Yeah, and maybe Fortinbras has the final word because he is the only one who really achieves the revenge he sets out to.
That's right.
To take.
That's right.
He moves in.
He moves in. And the other thing that Bergman did was at what's the final line of the play. The very final line. Someone have it?
Hold on 1 second.
I have it.
Let 4 captains bear Hamlet like a soldier to the stage, for he was likely, had he been put on, to have proved most royally, and for his passage, the soldier's music and the rites of war speak loudly for him. Take up the bodies, such a sight as this becomes the field, but here shows much amiss. Go, bid the soldiers shoot.
Go bid the soldiers shoot, right? So you kind of go, okay, what's going on? He's going to honor Hamlet, and they're going to do a 41-gun, 21-gun salute or whatever, though it's not really said that he's going to do that. He says, bear him up. So what Bergman did is that they had a video camera, and Fortinbras spoke to the TV, the live TV feed, video camera, that sort of said, yes, I'm going to honor Hamlet or whatever. Then the video camera was turned off, and he turned to his captains and said, go bid the soldiers shoot. And the soldiers started shooting outside because they were killing everybody, because it was a takeover, and it was Fortinbras's revenge. I still get chills thinking about it.
That's awesome.
And you kind of go, yeah, that makes sense in terms of the play. And in the terms of what Shakespeare did, the subversion of the expectation of a revenger tragedy inside a revenger tragedy, which then learns something about itself. Laertes at the end kind of goes, oh, this is not revenge, it's not sweet. Inside the larger, it's like a Russian doll, inside the larger, absolute revenger tragedy. And I looked at it, I went, Shakespeare kind of, I think, meant that. Or even if he didn't, what an amazing interpretation and choice. I can't look at the Hamlet now with Horatio alive at the end. I kind of go, why are you alive? Fortinbras should killed you. So in terms of...
So was Hamlet dead?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
by
Hamlet's
the
dead.
time
Oh, yeah.
Horatio was killed.
Yeah, Hamlet's dead. He's just died, and then
Right.
because Fortinbras comes in right after he dies.
So what did they do with Horatio's lines? Did they...
He doesn't have the last lines.
Well,
He had some.
he has some right within there with Prince Fortinbras.
Yeah, he just says the first ones, and they shoot him right after.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I look at that and I think it's like a template for so many other like plays like that is Sweeney Todd. Like I feel like you just described Sweeney Todd.
Yeah.
I need Sweeney Todd before I even knew Hamlet.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. Well, revenge, it's the whole idea of revenge, you know, and that's something that, you know, we go back to in terms of the Greeks, the Oresteia is about, you know, is it the cycle of revenge? Is it justice? How do you stop the blood cycle? You know, what is Medea? Revenge is a really big, our history we're living in right now is all about revenge. It's all about revenge. That's what's coming on. Revenge which people define to themselves as justice. And perhaps it is justice in a way. What is the line between revenge and justice? That is going to be a huge conversation for people. What is the line between gaining power just for power's sake or power in order to use for, you know, for the betterment of your polis, you know? The questions that the Greeks are asking, the original root of the word politician, polis, Oedipus's responsibility to his people. He is responsible to the polis because he is a politician responsible. He's the king. He's responsible to his people. Henry V is going to talk about that. You know, where is the line between ambition for power and responsibility of leadership? Right? It's going to be in the King plays, in the history plays. Shakespeare is really going to look at that in terms of, you know, what is the nature of leadership? You know, what are those boundaries? What is the love of money? You know, what do you do for money? All the way back to the Greeks, Oedipus is going to say to Creon and to Tiresias, somebody's paying you. You're doing this for money, right? So it's power, money, jealousy, revenge. Yeah, we don't deal with any of those things anymore. It doesn't exist, right? This is the same cycles of like, okay, how, you know, what's the moral code of these times? What are the questions that are being asked? You know, are they being answered? Obviously not. We're still in the cycle. You know, can the cycle be stopped? How can it be stopped?
So will you define a moral code then of like Shakespeare's time as opposed to now? Like, how is it different?
Well, the role of women is very, very different.
But is it? I mean,
well, the role of women, the attitude towards women.
Okay. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, this is what we'll talk about next week because we're going to look at a lot of these female characters in the plays. Yeah.
We take a break.
Yes. So what time is it?
It's like 2:15.
Oh my God! Yes.